I mean, the whirlwind is part of the strategy, I think, right? And so we're all caught in it right now, and it's exhausting. But you had written in January before the inauguration that 2025 will be the year when higher ed really does start to face the consequences of its past missteps. I'm pretty sure you had not imagined that all this would have transpired to the point we just made. And I think you were also hopeful at the time that it would allow colleges to break free of their legacy models. And I'm curious, like, are you still optimistic given everything that's gone on?
Michael, that's all I have to say. This is the problem with making any sort of predictions at the beginning of the year, which, by the way, I didn't quite call them predictions. I called them
That's
storylines
true.
because I try to get around that a little bit because you eventually have to account for them at some point. So I went back to listen to that episode, which dropped on my birthday, by the way, January 28th, about a week into the Trump administration. I wrote that in my newsletter, of course, right before the Trump administration. And I think I definitely got one thing wrong up front, and I probably got one thing right up front as well. So first on the wrong thing, I was pretty hopeful in that episode and in that newsletter that institutions would feel the financial, the demographic, the political trends that were taking shape, well before this year, and they would finally break free of those legacy models. And I guess what I didn't take into account is campuses needed some runway to do that. And we suddenly got into, the depths of the Trump administration pretty quickly. We saw all these executive orders come one after another, most of which affected the very elites, which weren't going to be touched by this reckoning anyway, for the most part. But it also started to touch institutions further downstream. Then we saw the big, beautiful bill that they're still debating and will be debating probably for a couple more weeks at least. And that really impacts student aid. And other things that will have a much wider impact on higher ed. And I think that colleges and universities to make these changes, they are slow moving ships. I didn't expect it to happen so quickly. And I thought they would have, the spring, the summer, perhaps even the fall of 2025 to start to turn the ship around, and particularly around something that we have talked about and something we just wrote together around culture. The culture change required in higher ed just takes a little bit longer. And I felt, again, they just needed that time. So that's the thing I think I got wrong. And I'm just
Hmm.
feeling a little less hopeful. I think that the cliff is going to come pretty quickly for some colleges and universities because they didn't have that runway. Kind of mixing metaphors probably there. Didn't have that runway that they needed. But what I think I got right was the trifecta in Washington. I think that higher ed was caught so flat-footed. And while everybody in America is, in American higher ed is wringing their hands about it, I'm still struck by how when I go to conferences, right? We've talked about this at GSV, for example, or I'm out and about, that the majority of the public just doesn't quite understand, or maybe they just don't care
Hmm.
about what's happening in higher ed. And maybe that's both sad and worrisome. And Michael, we haven't talked about this, but I'm kind of in the bubble of government here. And so I hear it all the time. You're kind of in the bubble of elite higher ed up there in Boston. Like, are people talking about what's happening with higher ed and all the changes and everything that's coming down from Washington? Or do you feel like there's disconnect once you walk off campus that, for the majority of people in Boston, it's like, eh.
Yeah, that's a good question, Jeff. I get a lot of WhatsApp messages, people saying, "Oh my gosh, what's happening in Cambridge? Are you guys all right?" Stuff like that. In terms of the dialogue more broadly, I do think it's crossing, right? I do think higher ed is the big employer. The town where I live, Lexington, a lot of, MIT and Harvard professors, part of the culture. I do think it's crossing into the day to day here, and people observing it much more than certainly 4 years ago. We weren't right at the end of the last administration with Trump. I don't think we were hearing it nearly as much. I think it has jumped into it, Jeff.
That's pretty interesting because, I was just at the Milken Global Institute, which probably had more elite degrees per capita than your hometown or my hometown in one room. And, when we started to plan those sessions back in December, we had these great panels put together. Little did I know that, all this would happen in the spring. And they were simulcast on Future You, and highly recommend to our listeners, if you haven't listened to those 2 episodes from Milken, I think they're really good in terms of helping understand kind of the big messages right now around higher ed. And Michael, we haven't had a chance to really deconstruct those a little bit. And so there were 2 things that came out of those conversations with me. One was Sian Beilock, the president of Dartmouth. And let me just say, Michael, super impressed. Really call me super impressed. Incredibly young by presidential standards, president, still in her late 40s, could have a very long career as a president, I think. And, she had this statement, which if you listen to the episode, you'll hear, as she said, you can't have free expression that robs someone else of free expression. That means not shouting down speakers, not setting up encampments that don't let other people walk across campus. And, every statement that she said that day at Milken, I just juxtapose with the picture that was in the New York Times recently from Columbia's graduation. I don't know if you saw it.
Yeah.
Pouring rain. Unfortunate. I hate when it rains on graduation, but the entire platform crew, which is probably the entire senior administration of Columbia, all up there with their big Columbia umbrellas. They were obscured. You couldn't even see their faces. You have Claire Shipman, who's speaking, who's the acting president. They can't even call her the interim president
Right.
of Columbia. She's wearing a baseball hat of all things. It's pouring rain and people are booing. And, if I'm a parent, if I'm a family member, the most joyous occasion of your life is college graduation. And it's raining. I get it. That's kind of sucks, right? But, on top of that, Columbia, 2 canceled graduations in the last 5 years, if you go back to 2020 and then last year because of all the protests. And now you have this, and your remembrance of college graduation is people booing the acting president of Columbia. I mean, it just shows you just how bad things have gotten. And again, going back to when I think of who can start to change these things, right? I just think that, when I go back to what Sian was saying at Milken, it's how higher ed is, as you always say, Michael, how is it playing in Peoria? And it ain't good, right? What's happening in Columbia right now is not good. And so we really do need to change that narrative. And I think she and Dartmouth in general are among those who can do it, which brings us to the second person that I spoke to at Dartmouth, at Milken, which was Bill Ackman, right? Who mentioned specifically, by the way, institutions doing it right.
And Dartmouth
one of them was Dartmouth, right?
Yeah.
Dartmouth was one of them on his list, as well as the University at Austin, as well as Vanderbilt, were 3 that he mentioned from the stage. Now, you might have sensed some nervousness in my voice in talking to him. It was probably a most nerve-wracking interview I've ever done in my life. It was 20 minutes live on stage under the hot lights. I was trying to fact check him in real time, which is really hard. And listen, I don't agree with his tactics, and I find myself disagreeing with him on a lot of things, but there were 2 things in general I found myself agreeing with him on. One, Harvard isn't entitled to this money. I thought that was a really good statement, right? We think Harvard is one of the best institutions in the world. I think we all agree with that. We all think they do great things for humanity, but he is right. They're not entitled to this money. There is a little bit of give and take with the federal government, and I think that's a discussion that needs to be had. Second, as he pointed out, it's the researchers and not the institutions that get the money, and they could move. Now, I don't think it's as easy as he thinks it is, but I do think that there's something that's happening here, that the power center of higher ed, I wrote this piece, probably 20 years for the Chronicle about New England, no longer the center of higher ed. Maybe we were 20 years too early, but maybe it's moving. Maybe it is starting to move. And maybe it's not just New England, but maybe it's, institutions like we haven't downloaded about Santa Ono moving from Michigan to Florida. And Santa would tell us that, hey, Florida's on the rise, right? There's a lot of money being put on. Yes, perhaps there's a crazy state government, but there's a lot of money being put into there as well. And so maybe what we're seeing is something new happening, a big shift in higher education that we probably didn't see coming, I will tell you, at the beginning of the season. But that might be happening here. And there was this statement that Ackman says. I'm not quite sure I agree with him, but I'm kind of curious what you think. He said this is the best time to start a university. Again, I'm not quite sure start is the right word, but this may be the best time to think, where do we fit in? Where do we fit in with this, with what's happening right now with elite higher